My name is Cameron Kennerly. Just to give a little bit of context, I work within marketing and advertising. I'm a copywriter. Been within the industry for about 5+ years now. So I'd say I'm pretty familiar when it comes to how brands should move and coordinate their efforts to enter certain conversations. And I do want to say, just as a disclaimer, I'm African American, but I do not hold the opinions of all people of color or minorities just in general. But that being said, I will obviously give you mine, and we can talk about this and kind of get into the subtleties of how to navigate a particularly sensitive time.
What is your take on how companies can find that balance, in terms of being relevant and not ignoring or being tone deaf of the current events?
Yeah, so it's as you mentioned. It's a very, very tricky issue, and particularly now more than ever, it's a tall order for any brand, for any company to try to wade into, particularly right now as it's an ongoing issue, and do so with authenticity and more specifically with sensitivity. Obviously, brands want to enter the conversation. They want to lend their support to a movement that could use it, right? And that has more or less been calling for national and even global support for decades now. And it's tough. It's tough because entering the conversation the wrong way can do a lot more damage to your brand than not entering the conversation at all. So you want to do so with a good amount of authenticity. You want to do so in a way that respects tenets of the movement without necessarily using this as an excuse to exploit it for essentially visibility. So the question, I guess, is how do you do that, right? So personally speaking, during this time right now, and for right or for wrong, I think to some degree, getting a feeling or an inkling of the zeitgeist of the general kind of, let's call it, social climate can simply be done on social media, right? So whether it's through Twitter, whether it's through Facebook, whether it's through Instagram, whatever, take it with a grain of salt in terms of how people are talking, because obviously sometimes those can be echo chambers, right? But understand that some of the more vocal opinions can also be pretty instructive, right? So for a brand, okay, perfect example. So recently, it was Nike put out an ad that was essentially saying it's time to stop, ignoring the problem. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's more aligned the words that they had. And a lot of brands have followed suit. Some have chosen to stay out of the conversation, but I think if you kind of keep your ear to the ground and you look at the response from large scale organizations that deal with these kind of social justice issues, the support from companies and brands is welcomed, as long as it's not shallow, right? So in the sense of, sure, you say that you care about Black Lives Matter. I know that Twitter recently changed their their bio to Black Lives Matter. But how are you showing it, right? So are you donating to social justice organizations and Black causes and minority causes? Are you championing police accountability more directly rather than just saying that you care? If you do choose to enter the conversation, the way to do it authentically is to do so in a way that's more than talk. Right, so actually do your research, reach out to organizations, reach out to activists, and ask them, how can we help? And sometimes that can be, simple as voicing your support or voicing your opposition to, the challenges that these communities face. And sometimes it's just donating or lending services or products or what have you that aid these causes. So yeah, I definitely think there's an authentic way to do it.
As a marketer or as entrepreneur or someone that has some kind of corporate initiative, to just say, well, I want to just have my voice be heard because it's just relevant right now. I think to your point though, I think the key thing though is action, providing support and providing resources, donating to the appropriate causes.
The idea of expectation, right? Like what we expect as consumers from a company, for instance, Nike or the Jordan brand, right? Which are, really popular among the Black community, right? The question is, what do they owe, right? The Black community for the dollars that we spend with this company, right? I think it is reasonable to say that, if a large patron of your business has been, the African-American community or just minorities just in general, when it comes to, issues of in this case, just basic human rights, there should be an expectation that, you give back to that community in some way. And whether that's through some supporting social justice organizations or community efforts or what have you, or at the very least strongly voicing and using your weight as a global corporation that's based in America, but have a lot of influence from a monetary level in government and politics and the way that things move and develop in this country, to make a difference and to try to improve the equity and the fairness of, in this case, particularly your consumers. I mean, I think it is reasonable to say that there is a certain level of expectation that, can be attributed to these companies and how they act, particularly as it relates to the business they get from the Black community in a general sense, right? I mean, we live in a country where, corporations are seen as people, right? So, then the question becomes, well, as a person, right, how are you voicing, or in this case, choosing not to voice your feelings on something? And sometimes silence is an opinion. Sometimes silence is an answer, right? And sometimes that can mean, hey, I don't really have the words to say, and I don't feel like I'm necessarily qualified to enter this conversation. And sometimes it applies to people, and sometimes it applies to brands as well. But I think the question is, if we're boiling, at least this particular issue down to, human rights, right? Then it really shouldn't be a question. I mean, if you support human rights, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're anti-cop, that doesn't mean that you are going to disenfranchise a huge segment of your audience base. And I know that some companies can fear that, more or less kind of stating as a company that everybody's rights matter, right? But particularly in this case, since we've seen an absence of it, Black Lives Matter, to show that in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes that can mean different things for different companies, but at the very least, stating your support is really important, particularly at this time.
One of the biggest things right now is really being, a good listener. How can we be a better listener right now as an individual and as a brand?
I think it's really important to keep one's ear to the ground. I know that I use social media. I mean, because obviously it's the technology of connection at this point. It's important to recognize that obviously, not everybody is on social media, and not everyone, sometimes the voices on social media can be vocal minorities, right? So it's important to kind of use that as a little bit of a temperature check, but social media is a good indicator, right? I mean, the trends that are moving, like the hashtags that are moving on Twitter, what people are saying on Facebook, that's a pretty good indicator of, let's say, the cultural pulse of the population, and understanding that it's important to listen, right? It's important to read about how people are feeling in whatever form that takes, and adjusting one's branding and adjusting one's messaging, accordingly, just to get a better idea of how people are feeling and the general tone and tenor of how to speak to them. I don't think it's necessarily expected for, a company that's relatively small in size to be giving, $1 million a year or what have you. I think it's just a matter of doing what you can. I mean, even something as small as sweat equity, right? So there's nothing that you can do, let's say financially, to support some of these organizations. Maybe you can volunteer your time. Maybe you make an effort to offer, whatever kind of services or products that you provide to some of these organizations. Not necessarily how much skin that you put in the game. It's the fact that you're willing to put some skin in the game. In terms of showing your support in that way, so whether it's volunteering, whether it's just, kind of donating what you can think is, morally responsible to donate. I think it's just a matter of showing that these issues are important to you as well, and you're willing to do something. You're willing to take some form of action. And I think I can say this as a Black person, is that Black people are historically very forgiving. We've put up with a lot, and we've tried to move past it, and we've tried to to be peaceful, and we've tried to hold hands and move forward together. But there are just certain things that are very, very difficult to move beyond. And I think that within that same breath, though, it's really, really just important to feel some sort of support. For the most part, a lot of brands, particularly because this is such a passionate and sensitive subject, are a little weary, enter, to some degree the fray, potentially say the wrong thing, or not, in this case, to some degree, kind of finish the sentence, right? So kind of giving a little bit of support, but not kind of going all the way. So a lot of brands are kind of in a position where they want to see where things go. I don't think that necessarily you have to wait until things are over. I think sometimes just knowing that, even in the thick of things, you're supportive of the fundamental tenets of, in this case, the movement, which is that Black rights are human rights, and it's important to acknowledge that, and it's important to hold the parties accountable when that basic sense of justice is broken. just as a society, doing what you can. And there, are some organizations that are involved with this right now. So, for instance, I'll give one just off the top of my head. There's the Minnesota Freedom Fund. And obviously everything, in relation to the George Floyd protests began in Minnesota. But it's a really great organization. From what I can see, I mean, they've essentially requested a lot of donations to fit the bill and to pay for the legal representation. A lot of people that have been caught and charged, with basically just protesting. And it's important to offer support for these people that are, taking risk to make their voices heard. A lot of organizations that are doing this kind of work, but that's a good one. And even just looking up ones that are local in your area, organizations that do a lot for the community, organizations that do a lot for the youth, whether it's education, whether it's resources, whether it's food, whether it's just basic human necessities. Little goes a long way.
Committed to making a donation for the cause. There was a nice article by the Rolling Stone, in fact, on multiple places that we can donate to. So I'll just be kind of sharing that in the comments.
Yeah, and I think that's really important.
What would you say to people that feel blocked right now? That feel a little bit frozen. I think that right now what we're all going through is fear. Fear obviously drives this instinctual survival idea of fight or flight, freeze sometimes. And, a lot of people are frozen right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I've had people reach out to me that have felt as though there was a lot of fear in terms of saying the wrong thing. There was a lot of fear in terms of entering the conversation and, potentially saying the wrong thing and being attacked for it. So they instead choose to remain silent, or they feel like they don't know enough about the issue, so they don't want to weigh in. So maybe they do, have very strong feelings about this, and, they are supportive, but they don't feel like that their voice is necessarily welcome within the conversation. What I would say in those kind of cases are, I wouldn't say that just based on the color of your skin that your opinion is not welcome, right? Or that your voice is not welcome. I would say that these are basic human rights, right? This is, I think, fundamentally what it's about. In this case, it's the fact that, in this country, particularly with instances of, unarmed Black men being killed, those basic human rights aren't being honored. They're not being respected, particularly when it comes to a lot of these officers in these cases that have patterns of misconduct on their record, and for some reason have still been allowed to keep their job, for some reason have still been allowed to work out in the field. That in instances where, violence occurs and it ends up in the death of predominantly young Black men, that those things are excusable. And, obviously that they're not. So I think entering the conversation just from the standpoint of these are basic human rights. It's not a lot to ask, right, at all. And it's extremely vital and it's extremely necessary. But in entering these conversations, to not feel as though this is a controversial issue, because, I mean, to be honest, it really isn't, or at least it shouldn't be. Pretty basic things. If you believe in human rights, then, you believe in Black Lives Matter. You are a part of the conversation if you believe that. And even just, voicing your support of host or however you want to voice it. I stand with the protesters. You know what I mean? Black Lives Matter. It's as simple as that. In mass, that goes a really long way. Don't be afraid to champion basic human rights.
Do you have any recommendations on how we can do a better job as a company to really empower people and to put their voices, on a platform?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of platforms, there's plenty of technology that's out there, but not everybody knows about all of them. So doing your part to kind of educate people and expose them to new things. So, I have friends, for instance, that don't listen to podcasts at all. They don't know what the hype is about a podcast. And, personally, I love them and I learn from them all the time and I recommend them all the time. So, sharing and recommending certain forms of content, certain, platforms, what have you, can allow people to kind of take advantage of those things and hopefully learn how to use them for themselves. George Floyd has a memorial fund that his family has more or less put together. And obviously they've lost, their son and their child. And, that's a devastating loss for anybody. So if you want to support the family directly, which I would highly recommend, even a little bit helps, just send them, what you would spend on lunch in a day. It could be $5, $10, whatever you feel comfortable with. But that is probably one of the best uses of your money that you will spend probably this year. So
link in comments. Check out the George Floyd Memorial Fund. Thank you so much for your time, Cameron.
Absolutely.